we are going to do layouts, specifically linear layouts and relative layouts. So I have a Android Studio project ready for us, and in fact you'll see a whole bunch of buttons laid out in there, and we are going to go over them, go over the individual layouts because they have nested layouts, which is something we want to deal with in this class. In order to make a complicated screen, you are likely to need nested layouts, one included in the other. So just to orient you, I have an activity with Java code, other resources, but we're going to focus on content main, which is the layout for our current main screen. You can see the XML here is a relative layout, and we're going to talk about how you specify things relative to one another. And this should start to be looking familiar in terms of what our width and height is. We're matching our parent. We have some padding. And the rest of the standard boilerplate here. Okay, so let's actually take a look at our buttons, and we've laid out our buttons in this sort of odd and complex style that really doesn't mean anything. It just shows you a bunch of different things about nested layouts. So our outer layout here is relative, but that's because that's the default. Inside we've got a linear layout, which is vertical, and inside that we have horizontal. This is where we're first going to start seeing our action. So we should expect to see, from margin distance from the top, a button here that is containing its contents, which is the text B1, and right next to it B2. This is contained in a horizontal linear layout, so one right next to the other. Now the linear layout itself has a gravity, and that gravity is center horizontal. That's why these two buttons are in the center horizontal. If we change this gravity to just be center, not much changes. If we change it to be start, it pops over to the left because we are a left to right language. If I put right in here, pops over to the right. And this should be fairly intuitive at this point. We are going to leave it as center horizontal. Okay. Okay, so that's buttons B1 and B2. And then next in our linear layout, and remember, this is our inner linear layout, which is a horizontal. We're embedded in a vertical linear layout. So this is item 1 in terms of the vertical, which actually contains 2 items, which are horizontal relative to one another. This is item 2 in the vertical, which also contains 2 items, which are going to be horizontal relative to one another. That's what we have here, which is another linear layout, which is horizontal. And here we have the gravity at the end, which puts it all the way to the right. Then within these buttons, sort of see the same familiar pattern. Here I added a gravity inside the button, and you'll see that what that gravity is doing is actually pushing the button's label all the way to the end. So gravity applies to the object itself, and in this case the object itself, the button, is this text. Gravity applies to this linear layout object. This linear layout object is this whole thing. So this whole thing is over at the end here. That's what the gravity applies to. Now, if we do go in here and we say layout gravity, leave that at the end. Let's go over here and say, I should make you a bet. What do you think is going to happen if I make this center? So this might be somewhat counterintuitive to you. It's a little counterintuitive to me. What we seem to be saying here is that this linear layout wants to be in the center. This button is just going to follow its linear layout. But this button wants to be at the end. So why isn't it at the end? Why is it right next to this B3? And the reason for that, I believe, is the definition of gravity. So gravity is sort of like a default setting. In the absence of anything else, try to go toward the end. But we actually do have something else. We're in the middle of a linear layout, which is a horizontal linear layout. And that's telling B4 to come right after B3 with a predefined amount of padding that is probably defined by our style. So because B4 is constrained to come after B3 by the linear layout, the layout gravity in this case is not going to affect B4. Does that make sense? It has a higher calling as far as its layout goes, and this is its higher calling. It's linear, so gravity does not affect it. Just like I was going to say, gravity doesn't affect you if you're standing in a building, but of course gravity totally affects you if you're standing in a building, and you would be upset if it did not. All right, maybe I'll work out my analogies in advance next time and write them down. Let's leave this as gravity, just to remind ourselves why this is here. Moving on, let's see. We'll let's make that the end also. I mean, is end bottom going to be any different? No. Oh, actually, no. You can see it moving up and down within its range, so that actually does affect something. Okay, but not super important. All right, so enough with linear layouts, because I find that linear layouts are generally a little too simple to do real work, and a relative layout is what I mostly use, and a relative layout really has enough power for most of your layout needs, excepting fragments. So a relative layout is a pretty straightforward concept. I don't think we need an orientation here. So the idea is you can specify, there's a default, but you can specify every object relative to other objects in your layout. So the first object is going to start in the beginning of my layout, and I'm doing a wrap content on a button, and here you'll notice I've specified an ID, and there's a reason I've specified an ID, and that is when we are specifying our relative layout, we need to use IDs. So this first button is my B5, and then my second button, I'm doing two sort of cool things. First of all, where do I put this button? I'm putting it at the end of B5. Okay, and then I'm also aligning it to my parent right, which means I'm going all the way to the end of the display. This is B6. So if I did not tell Android to go to the end of B5, what happens? It aligns to its parent right. It says B6, which wrap content, but now there's no constraint telling it to go all the way over here. And in fact, if I get rid of align parent right, what happens? Should have made a bet. In fact, B6 is now right on top of B5. So unlike a linear layout, when you put two things next to each other, in a relative layout, they actually go on top of each other. I mean, if you put them next to each other textually, or one right after the other, they just go right on top of each other. There's no sense of the linearity in space. Okay, so we have our two buttons and our relative layout. That's pretty good. Okay, this next thing is going to be about drawables, which I don't want to do in this. I'm going to keep this one short, and we will conclude here linear layout and relative layout, where relative layout, get some practice messing around with this stuff because you'll use relative layouts a lot, and I will tell you straight away that there will be a relative layout question on the exam. Thank you, and thanks for watching.